fourth annual Lone Star Lecture Series. My name is Dr. Michael Shane Powers. I'm an assistant professor here at Angelo State University in the Dr. Arnaldo de Leon Department of History. So the Lone Star Lecture Series is part of the Distinguished Lecture Series here at Angelo State, and it hosts outside scholars of Texas history to deliver a keynote address on any aspect of Texas history, and we hold it in March of each year, coinciding with the anniversary of Texas independence. The Lone Star Lecture Series is made possible by the very generous Dorsey B. Hardiman Endowed Chair in History. And every year the event is free and open to the public and designed to bring the ASU community, as well as faculty and staff on our campus, to campus to reflect on issues that have shaped Texas history. And we are thrilled to welcome this year's speaker, Dr. Juliana Barr. Dr. Barr has received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin. She has been a faculty member at Rutgers University and the University of Florida, and is currently an associate professor of history at Duke University. She specializes in the history of 17th and 18th century North America, particularly the Spanish borderlands, with an emphasis on American Indians. She has published extensively, including her first book, Peace Came in the Form of a Woman, Indians and Spaniards in the Texas Borderlands, as well as an edited collection, Why You Can't Teach U.S. History Without American Indians. She has also participated in various workshops with Humanities Texas. So today's talk relates to an aspect of her current book project with the working title Las Damas Azules and the Supernatural Logistics of War and Diplomacy. And there will be a period of Q&A following the talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Juliana Barr.
Thank you so much for coming out, and I wanted to begin, of course, by thanking Michael and Jason from the Department of History. I also wanted to say that it's an honor to be hosted by the Department of History, named in honor of Arnaldo de Leon, an historian whose work was very influential in my graduate training, and in the historian that I have become today. And I want to say it's always a pleasure, of course, to get back to Texas, and particularly West Texas, since I grew up a little bit down the way, or up the way, in Lubbock. So it's really nice to be here in West Texas. So today I want to tell you about this book I'm writing, which centers on the native side of a Spanish miracle tale, as you can see. So in the 1620s, there was a young girl in Spain who prayed very, very hard. And when she prayed very hard, she fell into trances. And while she was in those trances, angels came and carried her spirit to the Americas, where she appeared to Indians in various places and urged them to seek out Franciscans nearby. This story became so widespread and so important in the far northern provinces of what would become New Spain, that in fact, we could argue that she rivaled the importance of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City, in that she was a divine patroness for Spanish claims across the far northern provinces. So really everything from Texas through New Mexico, Sonora, and to Alta California. So what we have after that initial story, though, because this is so important to the Spaniards who hear it then, is, of course, they fan out in all directions across the landscape. I'll give you the landscape. So here it is in 1600. Now, these are maps from a Spanish demographer. So he's showing you how far Spanish people have moved north. So the Spanish are claiming much more politically, but this is how far they've moved. And 1 century later, they haven't moved much further. So the story I'm going to tell you takes place between the 100 years, between the two maps I've just told you. So, Franciscans, Jesuits, Spanish soldiers, anybody and everybody, they're going to fan out, and everywhere they go, having heard this story about this apparition. Every Native person they meet, they will ask, have you seen a woman in the sky? Have you seen a woman in the sky? Have you seen a woman in the sky? And so all of a sudden, Native people, they have to respond. What is this? What is this story? And so what I argue and what I find across this entire province is that this created moments for Native people to respond, to tell the Spanish a story in return, each offering their own unique take on what it meant that Spaniards were coming up into their lands. But what we have to understand about these moments is that they've often been spun in myth as if they were first moments, first contacts. But of course, in fact, they've had many contacts with the Spanish. And of course, we think of that border between the United States and Mexico as this hard and fast border, but there was no border. There are news, there are people traveling all the time, and so they know, they have much knowledge of what's happening far to the south, even if their own lands are not yet peopled by the Spanish. And so what we have to then imagine is, the problem is, again, right, because of the myth, we think about this landscape. But we've got to think about the Native reality, that in fact, this was a Native world in which all these stories were being told. So I've overlaid the Spanish demography down here, so we can think then what this means and this landscape that the Spanish are moving through. We also have to remember, right, that these stories are not simply part of Spanish history, they're part of Native history. And if we start the history of this entire region, of what we call the Spanish Borderlands, with the arrival of the Spanish, that would be like picking up a novel and starting in chapter 8. If you haven't read chapters 1 through 7, how in the world do you know what happens in chapter 8, right? We have to understand the centuries of Native history that have come before, and we have to understand that the Spanish upon arrival are entering somebody else's history. They're entering a stream of tide of events into which they are becoming players. But there's a different story being told across this land. Oh, and I'll show you. We can look at the whole continent this way. So we also then have to understand that these stories that these Native people are telling the Spanish are a product of this world. And so we have to understand all that comes into that world. Equally important, we have to understand that Native people were very much like European people at the time, right? This is the 17th century. They lived in enchanted worlds where, just like in Europe, there were gods, there were spirits, there were deities, there were demons, there were witches, there were all sorts of supernatural powers that intervened in human affairs. And just as in Europe, those gods and those spirits might bring divine favor, or they might bring divine punishment. They might bring good harvests, or they might bring drought. They might bring healing cures, or they might bring illness and death. And in times of war, you knew that your gods were fighting with you, while your enemies' gods were fighting with them. So these were cosmic struggles if you came into conflict. So undoubtedly, every Native story that is being told absolutely is about supernatural power. It's about stories of beings, of forces, of events that are endowed with greater than human powers. But that fits unerringly into Native narrative traditions just as much as it does Spanish miracle tales. So, the last part of the puzzle we have to know before I begin telling you these stories is that, as I've mentioned, right, the Spanish have been present for much longer to the south of all these borders. And every single time those Franciscan and Jesuits are spreading out, hoping to find proof of this miracle from Spain, right? They have to deal with the fact that they've been preceded for more than 100 years by Spanish militias, and by Spanish slave raiders who have been coming north. The thing is, Spanish forces identify themselves as the soldiers of Christ. They march under the banners of multiple different Christian entities and Christian symbols. They carry crosses, they wear rosaries, and more than anything else, they carry banners of the Virgin Mary. So, in so doing, then, their deeds that they commit under those banners transform the Virgin Mary into a war goddess, and they transform symbols of Christianity into totems of violence. So when these native leaders and these native war captains are looking at a Franciscan or Jesuit and saying, have you seen a woman in the sky? Right. They're going to think about all these other Spaniards when they're thinking about that question and when they're thinking about how they're going to answer. And we might see some preview, in a sense, of how these images have been transformed in the Native imagination if we consider rock art, petroglyphs, pictographs that appear throughout the Southwest. I'm going to just show you ones from Texas, since we're in Texas. So south of here, we would see images like these, and archaeologists who have dated these pictographs and petroglyphs to this period say that, in fact, what you see initially are images that seem to suggest, one, that they absolutely identify as Spaniards, not as Europeans, not as Christians, or as Christians, not Europeans, right? This is, because this iconography is so emblematic of the Spanish, when they present themselves as they come north, right? This is how they're identified, right? And so one archaeologist actually in Texas speaks of, right, that this seems very curious, this is very interesting, but then you begin to see this creeping fear and creeping hostility associated with these images. We might also consider images north of here, closer to me in Lubbock, and these are petroglyphs which initially were identified, and people thought that this might be a Comanche historical rendition of what happened at San Saba. But archaeologists now have studied it more, and it's like, well, no, it's clearly actually, if you look at the architecture in the rock art, these are missions in New Mexico. And so this is most likely a depiction of the Pueblo Revolt. And so the missions are on fire because they were burnt during the Pueblo Revolt, right? So we've also got to remember, right, that the Pueblo Revolt has just happened over the way, and this is going to affect how these stories are going to be interpreted. Okay, so I am going to tell you two of these stories. These stories happened, as I said, from Texas all the way through Sonora, but I'm just going to pick out two to tell you about, to show you how these stories move and change depending on where they are and when they're told. And one, I want to talk about how we can start looking at these stories for what Native storytellers and representatives of political nations were trying to tell the Spanish, and how this probably related far more to geopolitics and diplomacy and war. I'm going to show you along the way how I've had to study a lot of archaeology, I've had to study linguistics, and I've had to study native oration and narrative traditions in order to decode and decipher the stories that the Spanish record in their Spanish records. And because these stories are so associated, or have come to be associated with San Angelo and the very first apparition, I'm also probably explaining to you why there are no other pilgrimage sites after the story in 1629. So we might also think about that, since we're jumping later into the 17th century. Okay, so first I want to take you to East Texas and the Kingdom of the Tejas, a populous and powerful nation, the Spanish would hear, that were ruled by a king or a great lord who ruled with lieutenants and officers over a people that were so numerous that their cities stretched for miles. This was, of course, a city along the Red River that stretched for more than 50 miles along the river and 18 miles north and south of the Red River. Massive cities. They were a people so powerful that their warriors were feared by all their neighbors. They had an agricultural economy so successful that every community member had multi-storied homes, and they often had two homes, one a vacation home out in their hunting territories and one closer to home and their agricultural fields. They had commercial networks so extensive that they stretched to New Mexico, to the Gulf of Mexico, to the Great Lakes, and deep into Mesoamerica. And we can actually trace the connections between Cahokia up on the plains and Mesoamerica through Caddo villages. So their trading networks were beyond anyone else's. They also had a sacred landscape. They had a sacred built landscape so elaborate that temple mounds spread throughout this area and defined the landscape as sacred. And last, and most important probably to the Spanish, they would record that the Caddo were a nation so extensive that no one knew where it ended, because the great lord of the Tejas does not permit foreign nations to enter the interior of his country. So, in contrast then to this notion of first encounters, first of all, what we have to know is everything that Caddo already knew about the Spanish by 1689, remember. So, all those trading networks, all those ties to all these other native nations, right? They're bringing their news, they're bringing communication, they're bringing all sorts of information as well as all these trade goods, right? So, we could think, right, they're looking south down into Mexico. But before we imagine some perilous narrative that they imagine of oncoming conquest, Europeans are coming, we must see clearly what that colonial landscape looked like in Coahuila from a Caddo perspective. So when the Caddo look south, and we should remember, they're also looking west to New Mexico and what's been going on in New Mexico, right? They absolutely do see destabilized regions. They can see that a Spanish presence is disrupting native economies, native trade routes, their communication systems, and that much of this has come, the disruption has come in the form of, again, slaving and the violence of war. They are also hearing all sorts of stories, interestingly, that this destabilization has become with symbols and warnings and prophecies of gods, that there are battlefields where there have been tales of supernatural powers, of native gods, of Spanish gods, of prodigies, of portents. The gods are there on either side of these battlefields, aiding both sides as they fight one another. But when they hear all these, do we think the Caddo foresaw some inexorable Spanish frontier coming north? No. They really didn't, and they had little reason to do so. South of the Rio Grande, native coalitions were reforming, were coalescing, were coming together, wars were ongoing, and as yet there were no clear winners. To the west, we have to remember the Pueblo Revolt has wiped the Spanish from the landscape, and all the exiled Spaniards have taken up refuge in El Paso, very impoverished, having left everything behind as they have fled for their lives. So, as Caddo are looking across this landscape, all they see are, yes, there are many, many, many different nations and polities struggling, fighting, in conflict, but no powers have risen to the top. And the Spanish are just one among a multitude of different people in these cosmic struggles. Okay, so this is the moment that two stories will be told, because of course we have to remember that when you ask a question, have you seen a woman in the sky? Have you seen a woman in the sky? You're gonna explain a little more about what you're asking, right? So there's a story told in the question, and then there's the answer that comes in return. And what we've gotta realize is that when the Caddo leader answers that question, he's reaching back into a Caddo past to formulate his answer, but he's also forecasting a Caddo future, neither one of which he sees has anything to do with the Spanish. Okay, so now we've got to visualize the scene. So the Caddo, if you think about this powerful nation I've just set up, right, they had amazing border control, and we should imagine that their nation sort of was in concentric circles. And so what we find, right, is that they have very important admission rituals. No one, remember, the king of the Tejas does not allow foreigners to enter. And so what we can learn from later expeditions is that every single expedition went through the exact same admission rituals. They would get to the outer borders, the broken dotty dot line, right? And there would be some group there who'd say, oh, it's very nice that you've come. How about you hang out here? We're gonna send word in. We're gonna tell them that important visitors have come. So you just hang out. We'll take care of you. Somebody's gonna come. A couple of days later, a Caddo leader would come out. He would come out with many of his men, marching in procession, clearly as a show of strength. And then, only if they passed muster, would they then be escorted under guard along the Caddo highways. And then they would go through these concentric rings. So the outer ring were all their hunting territories. And then they would begin to hit more agricultural fields. And then they would hit the innermost, most populous areas where you would find the complexes of the principal chiefs. And this was where they entertained foreign dignitaries. And remember, they have many native allies. And so native allies send dignitaries all the time. They often have trade fairs where they have all their allies come in. So these innermost circles are where all these formalities take place. None of that happened in 1689. What happened in 1689 is that, I'm going to see if my pointer will work. Oh yeah, it will. That delegation of Caddo leaders with a bunch of men came out of the borders. Whoa, where did here we go. Came out, and they came here. They wouldn't even let the Spanish cross their borders. They actually met them along the Guadalupe River, 70 miles outside the border. Like, you're not even coming in, we are so suspicious of you. Okay, so next we have to consider the exchange of the stories. They don't speak the same language. How are they even going to ask this question and answer this question? So what we know initially comes the most from one of the military officers, Juan Batista Chapa. And he provides the most detailed accounting, actually the only detailed accounting of this episode. And he says, oh, as we sat together one evening, we asked the Caddo leader through 3 interpreters if possibly he had seen a woman who came from above, dressed in long robes, like that man over there. And he pointed at the Franciscan who was in their group. And to this, the Caddo leader responded, well, I've never seen her, but I have heard stories of her from my ancestors. But we've got to think about 3 interpreters. The 3 interpreters are one Spanish officer who knew French, and then 2 Frenchmen who were already living among the Caddo. So the question has to go first from the Spanish officer to the 2 Frenchmen, and then the Frenchmen have to translate into Caddo to the Caddo leader. So now I want everyone to remember when you were 10 years old and everyone played the story circle game, right? And you sit in a big old circle and one person starts a story and then they whisper it to the next person and you whisper it to the next person. And then you see how much the story has changed by the time it went all the way around the circle. So we've got a circle with a lot of people, and we've got 3 languages in which the story has to be translated. So circumstances alone dictate that only the bare minimum, the primary components of any story, are going to make it around that circle. So we've got a woman, we've got a remembrance or a tradition of the past, or a tale told by ancestors. We don't necessarily have a supernatural element, but she is in the sky, so presumably we'll go with that. So think about the bare bones of this, right? Okay, but you should be asking yourself, but Juliana, you said that there was a Franciscan present. What did he write? He didn't write anything, which tells me that whatever the Caddo said was not what he wanted to hear. What the Franciscan wrote about that day on the Guadalupe River was that through the day and night, I tried my utmost to show all possible consideration to the said governor, the Caddo leader. I gave him 2 horses, the blanket in which I slept, for I had nothing else I could give him. He also highlighted the difficulty of communications. He says, speaking Spanish and using as an interpreter one of the Frenchmen who we had with us, I said to the governor that his people should become Christians and bring into their lands priests who should baptize them, since otherwise we could not save their souls. Okay, wait, now we have more concepts. How are they being translated? We've got priests, we've got baptisms, we've got souls, and perhaps most importantly, we have a desire to enter Caddo lands, which clearly they don't want them to do. It's only a year later, on a second visit to the Caddos, that this same Franciscan will actually finally say, I think I have proof that our miracle apparition did happen among the Caddo. But what he will say at that point is something a little different. And what he'll say is, the governor of the Tejas asked me one evening for a piece of blue fabric to make a shroud in which to bury his mother when she died, specifying that he did not want any color other than blue. I then asked him, well, what is this mystery attached to the color blue? And he said, we are very fond of that color, particularly for burial clothes, and because in times past, we have been visited frequently by a very beautiful woman who used to come down from the heights dressed in blue garments, and that we wish to be like that woman. And he says, aha, this is it. Clearly, this is my proof. This is my miracle. It's that blue, I know it. But we've got to still sit back and think, wait a second, we've still got 2 completely stories. In 1689, we had a question about the female apparition, and that only said our ancestors saw somebody like that years ago. And in 1690, we have nothing about an apparition, but we have a desire for blue cloth. How do we put these together, and what do we make of them? So what we have to think about then is what story the Caddo leader was trying to tell these Spaniards. And we have to remember, right, he's not simply telling a story. He's telling a story crafted for a Spanish audience. We may see only a wishful Franciscan with the best intentions in the world. But what the Caddo leader sees as a man is a man who claims to wield supernatural power and natural power, right? He's come with all these soldiers. He is a representative of a foreign nation, and he wants to take up residence in Caddo lands. That's the person he's telling the story to. And he's telling them something that he thinks they need to hear. And it turns out what he's telling him is that there are rules that govern our lands, and all those rules apply to anyone who wants to take up residence here. And I'm going to explain those rules to you in cosmological terms. To do so, what he did was told them about a woman from the Caddo past. And she was no simple deity, and she was no simple guardian spirit. She was the progenitor of their entire world. And he was clearly explaining the tenets, one of the central tenets of Caddo origins and governance of their founding matrilineage. And we know this because Franciscans 20 years later write all of this down. And 20 years later, another Franciscan will write of this Caddo tradition. In the beginning of the world, there was one woman only, or as another scholar put it, in the beginning of the world, there were no men. Just think about it, just think about it. From her came the outline for the world, which began when the ancestors followed her directions to create the sky by placing stakes in a circle, which then separated earth from the heavens and created the world. Her grandson later saved the world from a giant horned serpent made with weapons that his grandmother had given and made for him. And then he ascended to the sky and became Ayo Caddo Aime, their supreme being. and she ascended to the sky and became Sky Woman. And as Sky Woman in the sky, every day she gives birth to the sun, the moon, the water when it rains, the cold, the snow, the corn, the thunder, and the lightning. It is she who had reared their first parents, taught them how to hunt, to fish, to make their houses and their dresses, and once they had learned all these things, she'd taught them everything she needed. She ascended to the sky. Thus, right, we can see in those little hints from Chapa and the little hints from the Franciscan, we can see what they're trying to tell about Sky Woman, a woman who came down from above, who came from the heights, a woman they wanted to be like because she was their first teacher and first exemplar of the Caddo socioeconomy, culture, and belief system. Sky Woman is also, in fact, key to understanding blue. So what you have to know about Caddo arts is that they don't have iconic art. They do not have figurative art of humans. They have flowing lines, swirling scrolls, concentric circles, as you can see on this pot, because all of it was supposed to represent the coming together and the creation of a symbolic system that represented the earth, the sky, and the waters. And colors were also absolutely central to their ritual structures. So all those temple mounds I showed you. So what they would do to mark their sacred structures is that you use different sands and you use different colors of soil, and you would layer in different ways. And blue, or green, was very sacred to them. The other key to know is, in fact, that in the Caddo language, the word for blue is the exact same for green. So in fact, he might have actually been asking for a green shroud. We don't know. So let's call it turquoise. So the whole reason that turquoise is so important to the Caddo is it is the color of the sky. And so it's the color of Sky Woman. But also, if you think about it, if she is the center of the creation of their world, their expression for when the world was new was that when the world was new, it was green. Because, right, it's like an avocado. It's bright green until it ripens, right? So that is the moment of the creation of the world. And blue-green sediment, turquoise soil sediment, is absolutely important in funerary rituals, that they have sediment that they put on burial goods and shrouds before they bury people. So of course he would love a fabric for his mother, who he, for whenever she is dying. And, but the other thing we also have to know, that also comes back to Sky Woman, because in fact the sky is not simply where she lives and the Supreme Being lives, but it is of course the residence and the final destination for all those who die and then go on to the life after. So the last little tidbit we get to better understand these stories being told with the Caddo came 2 years after that story exchange I told you. Because all the other Franciscans who kept traveling north said, we actually think that the nun may have appeared farther north of the Caddo. And one of the Franciscans even said that while he was there, living in a tiny grass hut, desperately trying to convince Caddo to listen to him, and they weren't listening to him, that he too was visited by angels, just like Agreda. And he too was carried hundreds of leagues to the north, to the Queño nation, who is unidentifiable, but that's what he wrote down, where God gave him the exact same gift he had given the nun, that of miraculous translation, so he could speak to them in their language. And for 8 days, he regaled them with the teachings and about the grace and salvation awaiting them from Christianity. And then, lo and behold, he awakened back in Caddo lands, where torrential rains poured down, flooding the Neches River, so that the current swept away his tiny little grass hut, and he then left and went back to Mexico. as the bringer, if you will remember, as the bringer of frost, water, rain, snow, thunder, and lightning, we might wonder if Sky Woman had cleaned the landscape of the intruders. Okay, so that's story number one. So the other story, we're gonna go all the way to the other end of the Spanish borderlands, and we're gonna go to Sonora. It's not quite Sonora because they haven't gotten up that far north, but and in point of fact, we're actually gonna sit on the Arizona-California border. And this is 10 years later, it's in 1699. And once again, the Spanish, we are sure we have proof of the woman in blue. She has appeared in this area, we're absolutely sure it's happened. And so you can see here, maybe I can, okay, wait, I've got a detail. Okay, so here's the Bay of California. So Baja California is over here, Alta California here. This is present-day Arizona, and this is the Colorado River, and it will be right along in there. Well, they're going to actually hear the stories all along here, but they'll finally write it down right here along the Colorado River. So this couldn't be more different than East Texas. This is a landscape created by volcanic eruption, desert wind, and very, very little water. It required absolute cooperation and no competition of its residents. You actually had to work together to get by, to survive. And in so doing, they created an eminently successful desert culture, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And so the people throughout this region were different humans people and different A'atam people. And within those various alliances, we will be following the stories told along a highway that connected an oasis, because in this landscape, there are not village sites, there are oases where people gather. And then there are all the roads that connect water, right? Because every day is about finding the next source of water. So you're in constant movement, and this is a world in motion at all times, over 500 miles between 42 different distinct oases that the Spanish would call teñajas. And every teñaja had a name, so there may not have been towns with names, but there were oases with names. And every name, of course, marked it as a site that had been claimed by people who might be ever moving but ever returning. And so in this world, right, all the stories are going to be told between along one highway told at an oasis, Sonadag, and then all the way to the Colorado River by Hiached A'atams and Quetzuan humans. And to give you a sense too, I love that the metates are in the water at this teñaja. So in this land then, what we've got to imagine, right, it's a desert. So there are going to be no big cities like the Caddo have. It is actually the trail and the highway system, which is the infrastructure. This is the circuitry of their world. Everyone's in constant motion, and you are constantly moving to see other people in these small groups, right? So travel becomes the metaphor of A'atam life. And what they will say is that travel represents all the life-giving entities, the powers, the ceremonies, the actions that are involved in making possible a life of propriety and dignity. And so they will talk about living a good life is walking a good path. So what it also means then is, right, is that travel is never random and always must be enacted with geographical precision, because you're going to die in the desert if you don't, but also spiritual propriety. You are obeying the rules of this sacred landscape. So, also in this world, as they're moving, I knew I had a map. I just hadn't showed it to you. They also, so in terms of artwork or iconic expressions of walking the good life, they have many, many sticks. There are walking sticks that give you spiritual protection as you move along these highways. But they also have calendar sticks upon which they record stories with mnemonic images on them, which then tell the storyteller, oh yes, I remember, and this prods his memory and he can then tell the story. And they also have scraping sticks that give rhythm and cadence to stories that are told. Because the whole thing is that as you move along these highways, every night, wherever you stop, and you're probably stopping at an oasis, and there may be other people who are stopping there as well. And so maybe you're gonna trade whatever food you might have, and you're going to share, whatever else you have. But you're also sharing stories. And so what you have is that every single night, all night long, everyone sits up all night long, sharing what they have and sharing stories. But stories can't be told by just anyone, because storytelling is a calling and an honor, because you are summoning the power of nature. So they will say, for example, you might be summoning the power of the mockingbird when you are telling stories. And stories define history, they define identity, they define every human exchange in this world. So, we've got our landscape. Now, what do they know about the Spanish? Like the Caddo, the Hiachet, and the Quetzuan have heard about the Spanish long before they ever meet them and before they ever come up far enough north onto their highways. But their information is coming from much closer afield, from battlefields that are getting ever nearer in the north. And particularly there are two wars in 1695 that are marking the landscape, and these are the landscapes of their extended kin who live just south of them. And these battles are being fought because Spanish militias are coming north, and again, they're coming north carrying a banner of the Virgin. And I should say, in fact, one of the Spanish officers who was involved in these wars had also been involved in the expeditions to the Caddo. So it is a small world, both in all these different connections, both native and the Spanish. And so, in fact, these military engagements are going to set the tone then for all Hiachet and Quetzuan understandings of the Spanish. And again, we have all sorts of supernatural stories being told left, right, and center from these battlefields. And their stories, though, very interestingly, reflect the precarity of this desert landscape and the threat that the Spanish pose, right? That there's this incredibly delicate balance that one must have to make it in this environment, right? And any threat to it can throw off that balance. So, for example, there will be one apparition tale of an old man who appeared standing in water up to his knees, and he foretold that if you do not contain the Spanish violence, all the springs will dry up, the rain will stop, and the prickly pear, the mesquite, the seeds, everything upon which our subsistence depends will disappear. Another was far more to the point. These foreigners who are threatening our world are demons. Although the Spaniards talk like humans, and they eat corn like humans, and they wear clothes, they are not men. So again, you can see the supernatural tone infecting all of these stories that are being told. So of course then, and here we will have not Franciscans, but Jesuits moving up with soldiers, right? They are going to engage in these all-night talks along the highways, and we'll go back. And most of these accounts and these interactions were headed up by a Jesuit named Eusebio Kino, who was one of the greatest cartographers. And so we know so much, actually, about the far northern provinces because of these amazing maps that he made. So they would, as they were moving along these highways, he'd stay up all night. Well, actually, sometimes he let this military officer do all the staying up late, and he would get tired. But they would stay up all night exchanging stories. And so what you have is, right, it was like, oh yeah, we have origin tales too. So he would tell biblical stories. He was like, oh, we have migration stories too. And he would talk about how did the Spanish come from Spain to New Spain, and then how have they been working themselves up. So in fact, you can see the Spanish adapting their stories to fit the stories they are hearing from the A'atam and the Quetzuan. Okay, but in return, they are also given stories, and it becomes quite striking that all the stories have some element of, okay, but you do understand that if you mess with our sacred lands, like there will be gods that will come and take care of it. And at one point they are even told that even the land itself will rise up in supernatural rebellion. And one of the Spanish officers will say that the supernatural rebellion comes in the form of a hurricane. I'm not kidding you, in East Arizona. So you tell me how a hurricane got into the middle of Arizona. Okay, so, and the other thing is, he is asking stories too. They're not just asking about, have you seen a woman in the sky? He's also asking about Oñate, because Juan Oñate, who established the colony in New Mexico, had also had an expedition all the way to the Colorado River. And so you can also see, right, he's even asking about a military expedition even as he's asking about the woman in blue. So here is what the military officer will, I'm going to give you a picture of a trail so you can imagine all night sitting in the desert hearing this story. So this is what the Spanish officer will record, being told. And when, again, he's hearing it over and over, so he hears it multiple times, not just once. A beautiful white woman dressed in white, gray, and blue, covered with a veil from head to foot, had come to these lands. She spoke to them and shouted and chided them in an unknown language. She carried a stick that we assumed was a cross, of course. They said the nations of the Colorado River had shot her twice, leaving her for dead, and that then she returned to life, flew away without them knowing where her home was, and then after a few days, she would return and chide them all over again, and the cycle would repeat itself. Okay, well, we've come a long way from the original miracle tale, right? Okay, so like the Caddo, the Hiachet and the Catsuan storytellers are constructing a story. But clearly here, right, they're taking a Spanish icon. They're like, okay, we're actually going to tell a story about you using someone you will understand. But again, what becomes fascinating if you study their storytelling traditions and their linguistics, it's amazing how the story I just read you reflects their traditional storytelling traditions. One, it is a classic travel tale, because every travel tale has to have 4 moves or 4 actions. So she arrives, she harangues, she dies, she flies away. Okay, so she's a traveler. That's good. And she's carrying a stick. And he will say, un palo. So she's carrying a stick. He says, which we took to be a cross. And what's very interesting is this is the only time the Spanish ever will associate this female apparition, the woman in blue, with a cross. It is only in Arizona that the Spanish add a cross to this story. And so it does seem very clear that this is an addition. But of course, we can know that it's probably a walking stick, maybe. And so maybe they're saying we had to shoot her dead because she's not walking the good path, because the Spanish are not walking the good path, and we're speaking metaphorically, and yeah, dude, we're looking at you. You're not walking the good path, and you should be listening to us. Except that then there's the rest of the story. And so the other thing I kept from you is that there's another kind of stick. So the A'atam have tally sticks that they send out when it's time to go to war. A different kind of stick. But more important than that, the Catsuan have battle staves. And so it is an absolute unique thing to their battle rituals that they have a battle stave that 2 men will carry out into the middle of the battlefield. And they don't fight. All they do is stand in the middle of the battlefield with the battle stave because this represents their nation. So it's not something that represents them, it's their nation. So as long as that battle stave stands up, then we will prevail in this battlefield. So it is the insignia of their nation, but it's also very important because to them, warfare is the concrete expression of spiritual strength. So we will win because our gods will prevail. So maybe she's holding a battle stave. Because we've also got to make sense of this thing that she's intelligible. All the other stories have said that God gave her the miracle of translation, that she could speak to them. And so now all of a sudden she's unintelligible. So in A'atam storytelling, Women do not speak because the storytellers are male. So by making her a woman, or by choosing, let's just assume maybe that this is the Virgin Mary, that is the woman in blue they're going to see the most, right? They can't put words in her mouth because they are men, and that would be improper. But she's also an outsider, so it could just be, we can't put words in the mouth of a Spaniard. But the other thing is this stream of invective. She harangued us all day in a language we couldn't understand. And then if you look at Quechuan warfare rituals, what you find is that they have pitched battles by invitation. So if my people in Lubbock, let's say, are going to declare war on you people here in San Angelo, I will send a message to your leader, let's say Arnaldo, and I will say, I will meet you at this day. And we will both show up. We will draw a line, supernatural line in the sand that neither one of us can cross. And we will stand along the line, and our storytellers, having channeled the powers of the mockingbird, will engage in oration. But the oration on a battlefield is a little different. I'm going to shout challenges. I'm going to say your mother is ugly. Do you remember when we kicked your butt last time? And we're going to do it again. And it goes on for hours until battle commences. And so now all of a sudden, can we see the Virgin Mary standing with the Spanish soldiers haranguing in a language no one can understand? The last bit, that ongoing cycle of death and rebirth. Every Christian in the room is thinking, resurrection, it's got to be resurrection. No, it doesn't. Actually, in fact, this is a reoccurring trope in Autumn Tales as well, because the fact is, of course, that it is beyond human strength to defeat a god of your enemy. It takes another god to defeat a god. And so you've got to call, that's why you call on your gods in battle. And so, of course, if this is a Spanish war deity, they can't kill her. Of course she's going to come back to life and come again. And so it's going to be this unending cycle as long as they are fighting. So we could pull back and say, all right, so probably the message is, okay, you foreigners, we can see what you've done down south. You're messing around, you're killing people. You are not welcome in our lands. And if you come, you need to know we're going to call on our gods. We are prepared to face you, and we will prevail again. It is incredibly telling that the highway along which this story was told over and over again, within only a few years, will become known to Spaniards and will continue to be known to Mexicans as the Camino del Diablo. You do not go down that highway because no good awaits any foreigners along that highway. And I'll go to another map. So here is, and this is from 1762. And so part of my point is just to zero in and see, oh, look, no one's there still. No one's bothering them as well. But in Sonora, we also have a very interesting addendum to the story, just as we did in the lands of the Caddo. Another Jesuit in 1723 will record another story of a female apparition. And he will say, somewhere along the Colorado River lay a house or a room where a woman who no longer talks to anyone lives alone. In the past, she would talk to them, and she used to give out some trinkets, but those days were no more. She's been reduced to an outcast, living alone in a house that no one visited, in a community with no ears to hear what she had to say. A few years back, one of the most evocative calls to better see this place we call colonial America through Indigenous eyes came from a scholar who said, the only way we're ever going to understand colonial America is if we stand in the cornfield with an Indigenous woman and we look over her shoulder to see the Europeans coming at us. I would add, we need to remember that we're standing in her cornfield, in her land, surrounded by her gods. I know, remind us of this. And that when she tells her story and when she tells the history of what's going to happen in colonial America, she's going to do it in the idioms, the rhythms, and the cadences of her own narrative traditions. What I hope I've showed you today is that, in fact, we can find those rhythms and those cadences of those native stories in the most unlikely of places, in the Spanish archives. So, thank you so much for listening.